who created the foundation of our country, who created its governmental form and system. So we find that over the decades following that, there was a lot of momentum and change. Basically, after the Civil War, problems in senatorial elections by state legislatures started to happen. In the 1860s, there was a senator from New Jersey, which his election was contested on the grounds he'd been elected by a plurality rather than a majority. Other things happened. There were instances of intimidation or bribery in some states' selection of senators. 9 bribery cases were brought before the Senate between 1866 and 1906. And then there were these things called deadlocks. And between 1891 and 1905, there were 45 deadlocks. Basically what a deadlock was is the state couldn't make up its mind who its senator should be. And so they wouldn't send any senators back to Washington. And so there are some obvious cases of real bribery and real corruption, but overall it wasn't that big a deal. Well, it wasn't played that way up in popular media and in publications. There became this popular or populist momentum towards the direct election of senators.
Yeah, and even leading up to the passage of the 17th Amendment, because the Constitution didn't stipulate exactly how the legislature should determine who that individual would be that they would appoint as a senator, many states opted to have a popular election, and then the legislature would appoint whoever won the popular election. That was happening in 29 states before 1913. So a good number of people, or a good number of states, were already practicing this in some form or another.
Well, Oregon was really the first state that pioneered direct election and did different experimentation. Nebraska followed suit. And essentially at the turn of the century, momentum, as I said earlier, for reform grew rapidly. There was this author named William Hearst who had the magazine Cosmopolitan, and he did all these muckraking articles. In fact, he did this series called The Treason of the Senate. And essentially these articles started galvanizing the public into maintaining pressure on the Senate for reform. But what was the Senate's reaction in those first few years, Randall?
Well, obviously they wanted to maintain the status quo. That's what the Senate was set up to do. It maintained the status quo. And it wasn't until it was apparent that the states were calling for a constitutional convention in order to change the Constitution and create the 17th Amendment, basically. It was until that happened that essentially the senators that were in office decided, okay, well, we're going to pass this amendment so it can go to the states. I think it's interesting to note, though, that even though there was this fervor around having this changed, that you still even had one state that completely rejected the amendment. Now, they were just recently anointed as a state, I guess, which was the state of Utah. You had others that didn't end up passing it, but there was only one state that said absolutely not. We will not endorse this amendment. We reject it, and that was the state of Utah, which I find interesting.
Let me just put it into a little perspective. I don't want to bog this down too much, but let me just show you how, even though this argument for the 17th Amendment is given as a reaction to bribery and corruption and all these things, this is the argument that was commonly used by proponents. But it doesn't appear in the historical record to actually have been a very big problem. Recent scholarship shows that of the 1,180 senators elected from 1789 to 1909, I think that's 120 years, only 15, or 1.3%, were contested due to allegations of corruption. And only 7, or 0.6%, out of 169 were actually denied their seats. So even if there was this small showing of bribery and corruption, which you're always going to have in a free government, the fact of the matter is it was just a small issue. But what they did in Cosmopolitan and other writers and politicians and popular movement and momentum was, oh, this is a huge problem. This is a huge issue because, and then the other issue was deadlocks. Well, between 1891 and 1905, there were 46 deadlocks across 20 states. And this is a legitimate concern. However, history shows that most of the repeated deadlocks occurred in newly admitted Western states with inexperienced legislatures, and that more experienced states generally only encountered the occasional deadlock. So essentially what I take away from this is that the 17th Amendment was a cure for a disease, as it was being called in the popular media and by politicians, but really the cure was worse than the disease. And as we see today, like in the healthcare debate, they take one issue and they blow up the problems, which they make huge, when really they're not that big a deal. And we shouldn't expect government to work perfectly. That doesn't mean that we fundamentally alter the entire formation of that government. It just means that maybe we take, a more narrow, reformed approach aimed more directly at the problem. But we don't think that we're smarter than the Founding Fathers and just, let's change the whole thing here. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So essentially, let's fast forward. And Randall, you tell us about when the 17th Amendment actually came into being and what's the fundamental change that it made.
Well, the 17th Amendment came into being at an interesting time. I mean, this was 1913. April 8th, 1913, the 17th Amendment was passed.
Progressive era.
Totally progressive era. Now, it also was passed almost in tandem with the 16th Amendment. Go back over time and see how many times you have two or more amendments passed in the same year. Okay? Very interesting, unprecedented. And
the Federal Reserve.
But yeah, the Federal Reserve was established that year. The 16th Amendment, income tax, was passed that year. And the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, was passed that year. So you've had a big change in the Constitution, being health of the United States, not necessarily the document, since that time. Because you now have, as we talked about earlier, the founders established the House of Representatives to be this heated house, this place where issues are brought up and discussed and debated because the people are passionate about it, and we're going to get a bill through, and we're going to get this taken care of, and then it's going to hit the wall of the Senate, and it's just going to sit there, and then eventually it's either going to fall off the side of the wall or it's going to be accepted and let through. That's
hey, Randall, let me just ask you, what do you think it's like to have a Senate that actually slows down legislation and slows the whole process down of debate and all this stuff? Because I don't know what that's like.
Well, I think for a lot of people, specifically people who are probably very big proponents of the 17th Amendment, I think it was really frustrating. Because if you wanted to get something through the House and the Senate, a law, whether it benefits
an $800 billion bank bailout, something like that.
Yeah. That all of a sudden, it became much easier. You're engaged in special interests of some sort. You want it to be as easy as possible to get your interests taken care of. And anyway, so prior to the 17th Amendment, you had all these allegations of bribery and corruption and all these other issues. Well, the unintended consequence is that it's probably just as rampant, but because we don't have the check of the state legislatures or the senators caring about their state legislatures, that most of them probably aren't caught as easily, I would say.
Well, you just said unintended consequences. Let's go into that. We've talked about the original intent of the founders. We've talked about the history of the 17th Amendment. Now let's talk about the unintended consequences. One thing that I want to really hit on here is the fact is when we went to a popular election of U.S. senators, instead of having the state legislatures pick them, it made us more democratic. Democracy simply